Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with Sister Tamsin. She is a Dominican sister who particularly teaches Latin to different groups of people here in Oxford. I'd like to welcome Sister Tamsin.
Hi, nice to meet you and nice to be on your channel.
So I've got quite a list of questions here, and I'm going to start off sort of with your vocation and how you came to not just your vocation, but your Catholic faith. I understand that you have a family background in Catholicism, but did your faith develop in any way at a certain point in your life that was significant? And how did that relate to your calling to the Dominican life?
Okay, so my background is that my parents were both eminent Catholic philosophers. My father was Peter Geach, my mother Elizabeth Anscombe, and so I grew up in an atmosphere of inquiring faith, and both of my parents were converts and very ready to address and answer any question. And so I was always very convinced of my faith. I mean, that was never really a question about it, because all the questions that I raised were fully and adequately answered by my parents, or when they weren't, I sort of was taught to continue to wrestle with questions until I found myself satisfied. When I was 17, Mother Teresa came to Cambridge and gave a talk at the University Church, which I attended, and at that point I thought, well, maybe I have a vocation to religious life, and then I thought, well, maybe I don't. And then I sort of had a mental compromise. I said, well, maybe if I don't get married before I'm 30, I'll think about it. One should be careful about saying these things. God has a memory, he remembers things. And then when I was in my midway through my course at university, I came to Oxford and I studied classics. And when I was midway through that course, I had some kind of existential crisis. I think that's normal when you're an undergraduate, and as part of that, I went and I talked to the chaplain and I said, I keep having this idea about religious life, and he said, well, you must get away from this idea of God as the hound of heaven. Now, he didn't say you don't have a religious vocation, but that's what I chose to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was in my mid-20s, I was working in a boarding school. I had a profound experience of the love of God, and I thought I had to explore further. And I did at that point visit a Benedictine house, and I realised very quickly and correctly that wasn't my vocation. And I thought, phew, don't have to do a religious life, I thought. There's a sort of recurring theme here. Mm-hmm. Fast forward a bit, I did a teacher training, and then I did, while I was doing teacher training, somebody gave a talk at the chaplaincy about pro-life matters. I went to see a Dominican father who was my confessor at the time, and I said, I think it's making me go mad, just thinking about nothing else than this. And he said, well, have you considered being a lay Dominican? So I joke about it. I said, Father, I think I'm going mad. And he said, do you think you'd like to be a Dominican? But seriously, what he proposed was very life-giving, which was that I should join a group of lay Dominicans. And they were a delightful group of wonderful, eccentric, mostly elderly people, and then a few more young people of about my age. At the time I was in my early 30s, also joined at the same time. And I gradually realised that God was calling me to more than just being a lay Dominican. And I became convinced. And there was a sort of period of time during which I was thinking, well, I'm very sure that religious life is the best sort of life, but I'm not absolutely sure that it's the best sort of life for me. In much the same way as, you might be convinced that being an Olympiad was the best way of being a healthy sort of human being, but if I attempted that, I would probably kill myself very quickly. Die because of the over-exercise. So I was not sure that it was the best thing for me. But then again, I had a profound experience of the love of God, and I realised that this was indeed what God was calling to me to. And now that's sort of nearly 30 years in, so I guess I've sort of run the course so far.
So now that you've been a Dominican sister for so long, could you perhaps give us a brief explanation of what the day-to-day life of a Dominican sister in particular looks like?
Well, one of my sisters is fond of saying, if you meet one Dominican sister, you've met one Dominican sister. And in my congregation in particular, there's a huge variety of missions. So at the moment in my community, 3 of us are teaching in the studium here in Blackfriars. I'm a teacher of languages. Sister Anne Catherine, who's my prioress, teaches ecclesiology, and Sister Mary Magdalene teaches Christology, I think, at the moment. But we've also got somebody who's trained as a GP and is working in hospital chaplaincy, and people who help and visit the elderly. And I mean, one of the great strengths of my congregation has been the variety of mission. On a day-to-day level, when we're at home, I don't live in Blackfriars Studium, I live in Cambridge. When we're at home, we have morning prayer at 6:45, and then we go for Mass with the brothers in Blackfriars, Cambridge, at 7:30. Then we have breakfast, and after breakfast we sort of disperse to our various things that we're doing, studying or teaching or working in the hospital or whatever it happens to be. And then if we're in the house again, we meet at 1:20 and we have the office of readings. And then after which we have lunch, at 6 o'clock, on most days there's adoration of the Blessed Sacrament available, after which we have Vespers and supper, and that's the sort of normal day.
So would you say that, I know that the Dominican friars here at Blackfriars, they centre themselves around Veritas, the sort of the searching for truth and the preaching of that truth, as well as the contemplation side of things. Would you say that the Dominican sisters are distinct in certain ways from the friars in their mission?
Well, we're not priests, so our mission is perhaps wider. I don't know. It would be presumptuous to say that, but different because we're none of us priests, of course, and we are. Oh gosh, what should I say about that? We're sort of related by the common enterprise of knowing and preaching the truth. So Dominicans have 3 mottos. The first one's very short, it's Veritas. and so we all have this calling and devotion to the truth. The second motto is slightly longer. It's laudare, benedicere, predicare, which means to praise, to bless, to preach. And the third one is contemplata alis tradere, to contemplate and to hand on to others the fruits of contemplation. So those are our main mission described in few words. There's also any Dominican community, and this applies to the brothers just as much as to us. Any Dominican community is built on 4 pillars. So the first pillar is, of course, prayer, and then study and apostolic work and community life. And making the balance between those 4 things is always sometimes one thing tugs more than another, and sometimes one thing is more difficult than another. Occasionally, all of them are difficult, but generally, you support the community, or the community supports you, and that's the basic idea of community life. And it helps, living in community helps one to be faithful to the life of prayer. Study is a sort of ascesis, a kind of what we do instead of working in fields or penitential exercises. I'm not brilliant at that. And then prayer study, community life study, the apostolic thing, the going out, that's a sort of, that can be life-giving, and it can be draining, and it can be both at the same time. So as well as teaching, I also do some catechesis, and that's very much something I feel is both things, both the sort of stuff, if you work with youngsters, there's a way in which they give life, and also a way in which they sort of draw life out of you at the same time. It's an extraordinary thing. I'm not sure if I've quite answered the question.
So you would say, it seems that you're saying that there are many different spiritual challenges, not just spiritual but also physical, along the way in your Dominican life.
Not so many physical. I mean, we're very well looked after.
Okay.
I mean, we have to keep a house, but so does everybody. Who doesn't?
Okay, going on from your role teaching, how do you go about teaching in today's society where many things that used to be taken as the foundations are now being questioned by skeptics and atheists? And I know perhaps much of your teaching is to those who already have a faith, but is there anything in particular that you can say on the challenges of today's sort of modern world?
Well, I mean, one of the things I do is that I have a something of a presence on Facebook, and I try to make that about the true, the good and the beautiful, and also have a few jokes in there, because I don't want people's minds to glaze over with boredom when they see my name. Mostly I share what other people have put, and very occasionally I put something of my own. And I also run the community's website, the congregational website, which is stonedominicans.org. What can I say about... I mean, confronting the culture is something that we have to do as Catholics. I think that when my parents were growing up, it was easier to be a Christian in our society without sticking out very much. Being a Catholic may be a little more difficult. Um, and, you know, every generation has its own challenges. So with them, you know, suggesting that it was wrong to bomb cities and use artificial contraception put them at odds with the rest of the society, and some Catholics as well. And now there's so many issues where one has to let the truth of Catholic faith be the guiding star in one's life. And sometimes, you know, even one has disagreements with fellow Christians about some things. I think that the really important thing is to, my personal motto is alethouontes en agape, which means there's no exact translation of the first word alethouontes, but it means it's variously translated as doing the truth or saying the truth in love. And it's extraordinarily important that if one is going to engage with people about matters of faith in truth, one must do that also in love. It's no good arguing with someone and actually winning an argument if you don't win their heart. When you argue with people as a Catholic or as a Christian, or when you engage with people, seek to persuade them, that your first aim should be to show love to them, whatever that means in the context.
Moving as well to, again, your teaching work and your teaching Latin. Mm-hmm. I know that now we have the Novus Order and we've had it for some time, but Latin is still often seen as a very important part of the Catholic faith. Can you perhaps give your thoughts on how important the Latin language is for the liturgy and for the faith, and why this is the case?
Well, I'm an entirely Novus Ordo Catholic. I was brought up in that, and I mean, I can remember when it was happening. So when I was sort of 7 or 8 years old, there was sort of a translation which we learned, and then that was amended, and there was another translation which we learned. I remember finding it slightly irritating as a child that, you know, you just had learnt the Gloria and then they changed the words, or whatever it might have happened to be. But so I think people can be a bit superstitious about Latin as a language. I think it's a great good thing that there is a universal language of the Church. And if ever you go to Rome or Poland or Hungary, where when you don't know the language, it's very nice if you can find a Latin Mass and at least you know, well, what the Creed and the Gloria and the Sanctus and all those things are if you find a Mass in Latin. And it's also, one of the important things is to have a norm. And the problem with living languages is that they change. So you have words like, even, you know, religious words like charity. Many people in our culture don't know what the word charity means. They have not a clue. Whereas if you have the word in Latin caritas, and then you say that is love of God and love of neighbour because you love God, then you're translating a Latin word that has not and cannot change because it's not in a living language. It's in a language that's static, that's not going to change its boundaries or its borders. So having the church documents and the liturgy originally and always written in Latin, so any church document becomes official when it is translated into Latin, and that is important for the reason that I mentioned, that you know you you can have a bad translation, but if people can go back to the original and say, well, hi, come on, this says this, that the norm of the Catholic Church is this and not that. And you might say, well, why couldn't it be Italian or German or French or English? And the answer to that question is that English changes all the time. Think about the word wicked. What does wicked mean? Wonderful or intrinsically evil? You have to have a norm from which the translations are operating. Otherwise, you have something that will just shift and shift again.
I think it's quite unexpected, or interesting at least, that you say that you've attended Novus Ordo masses for your entire life, given the fact that you have then gone on to teach Latin. Is there a particular reason you decided to teach Latin, or was it an academic interest, or is it that stability?
I kind of fell into it. I fell in love with Latin and Greek when I was at school. There's a slightly longer story to that, but it's not that interesting. And then I did a degree in classics in Oxford, as I said, and then I did quite a lot of different things, and eventually did teacher training. And the thing that I'm qualified to teach is Latin and Greek. So that's what I teach. But I'm not. It's almost because I know Latin and Greek, and I know that, as well as the lovely sacred things that are written in Latin, there are less lovely and less sacred things that are also written in Latin. It's a language in which people were operating between a couple of centuries before Christ through until the modern era, and everything and everyone has written in it, and everything and everyone has written, not everyone has written in Latin, of course, but all types of people have written in Latin, and some of those people are deeply unpleasant. So I don't think it's in Latin it's going to be holy. Why would it be? It's not a holy language. Holy things are written in it.
Okay. I see as well as you're teaching Latin in your capacities here and in Cambridge, you have made some short videos and songs online about some simple aspects of the Latin language. How do you think those who maybe, I suppose many Catholics might be interested in learning some of the Latin language, how can they go about doing this? Because, like you say, it's a static language. It's no longer being used, at least by entire countries. So how can they go about learning?
Well, there are many courses online. I teach Latin online to all comers where from time to time I advertise a course and people will come to me. But also there are many other people doing that. I think if it rather depends what you want. I can recommend courses. But horses for courses, There are many reading courses. The advantage of those is that they're sort of accessible. The disadvantage of them is that they're limited, and so once you've done, you're kind of within the parameters of that. I'm talking about things like the Cambridge Latin course and to some extent the Oxford Latin course and Lingua Latina per se, whatever that one's called. There are various reading courses, and I've had people come to me who've been through such courses, and there are advantages that they aren't afraid of long texts. I teach a thoroughly grammatical course, and the reason why I do that is that I think it's quicker, that you get past the boring bit pretty fast, and then you can read real Latin written by real Romans, or real Latin written by St. Thomas Aquinas, or read and understand the liturgy. When I'm teaching, I expect people to be able to read the New Testament within 6 months, or the Gospels anyway, and to be able to read Aquinas within a year, and other authors within 2 years. Aquinas writes awfully easy Latin. The difficulty with St. Thomas Aquinas is not the Latin, it's the thought.
Through your experience teaching people to read these different, particularly Aquinas, I suppose, and the Bible, are there particular things that your students say that they get out of the texts when they can read it in Latin versus when they may have had to read it in the English translation?
Well, there are things that I point out to people, whenever people translate, they make decisions about what to leave in and what to leave out. And also, sometimes there's a nuance in one language that's not there in another. I could give you an example if you like.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Okay. Everybody knows the creed begins Credo in unum Deum, right? People who know Latin know that anyway. Credo in unum Deum, and that is translated. The creed begins. I believe.
I believe in the Father.
I believe in one God.
Yeah.
Okay, I believe in one. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
I was just froze.
Yeah. So I believe it. That's how it's translated. I believe in one God.
Father Almighty.
Right. The trouble with that is that it's not what the Latin says.
Oh.
And it's not what the Greek says. What the Greek and the Latin both say is, I believe into one God. And the reason why both the Greek and the Latin say, I believe into God, is that's what the Gospel says. You get some translations of the Gospel which sort of attempt to wave in the direction of it being a slightly odd formulation by saying, I believe on Christ. That's more in Protestant Bibles than Catholic ones. Have you seen that?
I don't think I have seen it,
right.
actually,
Well,
but maybe I haven't.
I think it's in the King James, I'm not sure, but I definitely have seen it.
Okay, yeah.
But, it's actually neither in nor on, but into. And why into God? Well, I think that theologically it's interesting to believe into God in that sort of moves one away from an idea that one can get one's head around God, and rather, so I don't believe in God the way I believe in Australia. I believe into God, which is a sort of process and a journey and a deepening. And that's the sort of thing that I might point out to my students. And they're always very interested in that.
Would you...
Just one more thing. Yeah. I also think that, there are many concepts which are in St. Thomas Aquinas, which are translated into, frankly, philosophical jargon. But when you unpick what the Latin actually says, it can sometimes be much simpler. So an example of that is sanctifying grace. Well, what's that? But in Latin, that's gratia gratum faciens, grace that makes you graceful, which, is much simpler than sanctifying grace.
So that's interesting. So some people may feel like if they haven't got the time, I know we all probably have more time than we'd like to admit, but if people, for example, are caught up with the hustle and bustle and are working full-time jobs and don't feel that they have the time to study formally, but still feel they have this calling to sort of the intellectual side of their faith, how would you advise them? Would you say that formal education is sort of a necessary step forward, or
what for
gaining a more intellectual understanding of the faith, or can independent reading, but then how would you suggest that they should go about that without just reading random texts?
I think the first thing is to have read the Bible. That helps. I think, and you know, there's many aids to doing that are on the internet, and you know, there's the Bible in a Year course, for example. That would be a very good way in. And then the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a good shortcut. I think that both the Bible and the Catechism are things it's hard to swallow whole. So I think that I wouldn't recommend people to read the Bible the way that I did, which was I started at the beginning and proceeded to the end of, well, I read the Old Testament and the New Testament a page at a time. And when I got to the end of the Old Testament, I'd read the New Testament about 4.5 times and the Old Testament once, and then I stopped. I mean, I don't mean I've never read any of it since. I mean, I stopped having the good habit of reading a page of each a day. But it does mean that I do know the scriptures, at least the New Testament, very well indeed, and the Old Testament moderately well. But at the same time, I think that wasn't a very intelligent way of proceeding, and I think that, you know, following a course of study, and you know, we're uniquely privileged at the moment because there are all of these online things that are available. I think that you have to be careful of the provenance, where, as you know, look at where someone is coming from before you entrust your soul to them. In any context, but especially online. You know, and make sure that they are priests or laity in good standing with the church, who are in full communion with the Pope and the bishops, and who, you know, believe what the Catholic Church believes and teaches. And you know, there's plenty out there that's not that, and you have to proceed with a bit of caution when you come to those things. And so Bible, Catechism, and then there's a lot of courses of study offered by the Dominican universities. In Oxford here they have things, and the Angelicum in Rome has things on offer, and I'm struggling a bit here.
I think that the Bible is sort of a foundation, but like you say, I do think that there seems to be a lot more in terms of resources these days, with Father Mike Schmitz is a famous American priest who, like you say,
and Bishop Barron,
yes,
you know, and then the Thomistic Institute, and Blackfriars Oxford, and you know, there are many things of that kind,
and I think perhaps starting as well reading the Gospels can be a sort of easier introduction than starting in Genesis, and then you have Exodus after Genesis. So
well, I did read the Gospels at the same time, so I read But I think that but there are Bible reading courses where things are put together which kind of fit together and throw light on one another, and I think that doing that sort of thing is a good idea. Okay. And also, you know, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Again, you know, with that, I think what you should do is to think about a question. What question do I have? And then go and see if you can find it in the index of the
Mm-hmm.
of the rather than, start at the beginning, work your way through. I mean, that's, it's a solid and reasonable thing to do, but I think most people would probably get bogged down. Whereas if you regard it as a book of reference, like an encyclopedia, and find what you want to know about in it, that's probably a better way of proceeding.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Well, you mentioned, I think, in response to the very first question, your parents and their sort of strong philosophical heritage that you come from. So I'd like to ask a few questions about their work and your relationship with them and things like that. Firstly, your parents, like I say, were both influential figures in philosophy. What was it like, sort of in basic terms, growing up in that sort of household? You mentioned that they were converts and they weren't afraid of answering your questions, which I think is something that lots of people could benefit from following on from. So could you give us some insight into what it was like?
Deeply interesting. I mean, they were very interesting people, and they, I remember as a child, not wanting to go to bed because the conversation was so interesting. I felt I was missing out. There wasn't much by way of gossip or small talk. So it's something that I feel a little bit hampered by myself. I'm not very good at small talk because I'm very used to large talk. So they would, my father would read the encyclopedia for pleasure, and also the dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, and the Summa Theologica of St Thomas, and everything else. He's one of those people sort of kind of functionally omniscient. When he was discussing, about himself and my mother, he said his knowledge was wider, but hers was deeper. As I said, they were both converts, and they both therefore talked about the process of coming to the truth, and that was deeply interesting. And they both thought that the faith was the important thing, by which one should guide one's entire life, and we prayed together as a family. So we didn't have long prayers. We had a sort of family prayers, which would be an Our Father, Hail Mary, Glory be, May the souls of the faithful departed. A few short petitions, they were the same every day. And then a psalm, and then a short ending prayer, and that was it. But we prayed that morning and evening when we were at home. A funny thing was, when I was the youngest child of my parents, and so the cry would go up, let's say prayer so that Tamsin can go to bed. And my brothers and sisters are still saying this, because I'm now a creature of habit and I tend to go to bed earlier than they do. So if I'm staying there, let's say prayer so that Tamsin can go to bed, it's still the case. But what else about them? I think that they taught me to regard devotion to the truth as being absolutely paramount, the most important thing.
Okay. And this is carrying on the topic of your parents, but more specifically about their work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't obviously have a very deep understanding of their work, but I understand your mother worked quite a lot on ethics.
Mm.
And so I was wondering, because I don't know much about her particular work, and others might be interested as well,
Mm-hmm.
what parts of her work do you find particularly interesting and maybe relevant to the Christian life as well?
Okay. I think probably if I gave us the best sort of potted biography I could give, it would probably help. So, my mother, as a child, read quite deeply, and she was reading G.K. Chesterton in her mid-teens, and she was in the midst of reading The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, and she thought, well, if that's true, I guess I'd better pray. And she got down and knelt, and that was the moment of her conversion. I sort of kicked myself that I never asked her quite what happened there, but I suppose that was a bit personal, and she didn't say more than that was what had happened. And then when she went up to Oxford, she became a Catholic, in fact, quite early on in her time at Oxford, and then she became a student of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and that sort of broadened out her thinking about language, I think, was the main thing. But I'm not my parents, I'm not an expert in this. But the thing that the sort of biggest sort of thread of thought, I think, that people would recognise in her work was around the idea of intention. And old-fashioned moral theology sort of brought one up on the idea of double effect. And double effect is indeed something that one can consider. If you shoot someone who's shooting people, you're saving the lives of the people that you are defending, but you're still killing a man. And the question is, what's your intention? To save the people, or to kill the man? If you what matters is what is your intention, and that was fine. But then people got a notion that you could do what were manifestly intrinsically evil actions, so long as you thought of them otherwise than what they were. And indeed, I've had a Catholic priest who was brought up in this sort of notion, saying to me that a Nazi who truly believed that Jews weren't humans would be justified in killing them. And that was one sort of fairly evil strand of theology that went right into the Catholic Church, but it was quite abroad in the general society, and it still is. The idea that you can so redescribe an action that you can do something intrinsically evil, so long as you're sort of imagining it as something good. My mother rather famously objected to the conferral of an honorary degree by Oxford University on a President Truman, and she said it was completely wrong to give a man who had bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or been the instigator of those bombings, to give that man an honorary degree. And she said, if you're going to give it to him, well, what Genghis Khan are you going to give it to next? She also was famous for standing up for the Catholic Church's teaching against artificial contraception. And she perceived in both of these issues a common thread, which was this idea that if you re-describe what you're doing, you can do what are intrinsically evil acts. So she wrote a book called Intention. It's quite a short book. It's an important one. And basically the argument is that you intend to do what you do, and you cannot point to something beyond what you're doing simply in such a way that it makes it all right to do something intrinsically wrong to do. And that is quite complicated because, in the first example I gave, if you shoot to kill the man because you hate him, that is your intention. And the fact that you happen to save a whole lot of people's lives doesn't change the fact that that was your intention, and then therefore what you did was intrinsically evil. But if you shot him in the leg and he happened to bleed to death, or attempted to disable him and he happened to bleed to death, that would not be your intention, and you would be saving the people. And that the mistake made both in justifying bombing cities and in justifying artificial contraception was to take the long view, ending the war or securing a viable financial future or the health of the mother or whatever it would happen to be, taking that long view as being a justification for doing something intrinsically evil in the first place. And what she said is, no, if you know what you're doing now, there are some things which are so much against the natural moral law, there's some things that are so much against the natural moral law that there are no circumstances in which you can do them.
Okay. And we've spoken quite a bit on your mother here, so, and particularly on, I think you mentioned earlier as well that she was also involved in the pro-life movement, as well as you just mentioned the contraception issue. Is there a particular topic that your father spoke on or worked on that you find interesting?
Well, he wrote a book called The Virtues, which I admire. His main thing was analytical logic, and I'm afraid that's a bit of a closed book to me. But I remember in his book on the virtues, he wrote very wonderful prose, I remember in the book on the virtues, there's this wonderful phrase where he says, if what we understand by faith is true, then there are some things that should be true about it, which is that it should cast light on surrounding topics. And he listed out several things, and I can't remember all of them, but one was that early science was hampered by the notion that things like light and darkness and heat and cold were equal and opposing forces that fought it out between each other. This is scientific nonsense, but it's what used to be believed. And it was the Christian notion that about what goes with charity, which is that charity isn't about good and evil battling as equal things, battling it out, but rather that the love of God in you is something that can be present in you in lesser and greater amounts. And it doesn't have to include an opposing force It can, of course, there can, of course, be, tendencies to evil in you, but that's not what charity is about. It's about greater and lesser degrees of the same thing in different amounts. And the other thing is something that is not. So with heat and cold and light and darkness, having that conceptual framework where you just have more of one thing and the other thing is the absence of that thing, that advanced science, although it was originally a theological idea.
Interesting, yeah.
And he made a list, and there were a few other things like that he listed in his book. And the other was just an extremely beautiful bit of poetry where he said that a mystery of faith is not a darkness, but a sea of light, depth beyond depth, which I always loved. And
Do you think that your parents have both? Do you think that the way in which they raised you played a role in your choice? I know it's a calling, but do you think that they played a role in the development of your faith and you eventually entering Dominican life? And do they play a role in how you live out that religious life today?
Absolutely. I mean, my parents were both instructed in the faith by Dominicans, and also, as I said, my father read all of the Summa, as far as I know, and my mother based a lot of her philosophical thinking on St. Thomas Aquinas. And just to start there, that means that any answer that I have received on matters of faith, although I haven't read very much of St. Thomas at all, I mean, I've read bits, but most of the answers that I have in my head, which I inherited from my parents, are potted St. Thomas. They just are. That's just how it is. That's one thing. I think that the great devotion to truth, which is a mark of our order, was something that was very dear to them as well. I think that the sense of the importance of the hierarchy of values, God first and then everything else afterwards, that was a motivating force. And I think that the general courage to be somewhat countercultural was something that I inherited from them.
Okay, well, thank you again. I'm going to ask one closing question that I think links on from that discussion and rounds things off nicely, which is that when you look forward, how do you hope both Catholics, non-Catholic Christians, and perhaps even those who have no faith at all, how do you think they can learn from the Dominican tradition, and what can they take away that's most important from the Dominicans in particular?
Well, I think from what I've said before, it'll be rather apparent what I'm going to say. I think that you should always seek the truth and not be satisfied unless what you are receiving is true. But that your development in truth has to be in the context of love, and that is how to advance in faith. That the nexus of truth and love is the way forward.
Okay, well, thank you again for coming on and talking. I know we've just about taken up all of the time, so thank you for answering all of my questions.
Okay, well, thank you for listening to me.